There's just something magical about a high-revving sports car. 9,500 RPM is the highest redline ever painted on a tachometer of a street-legal production passenger car. And it wasn't a rotary, it wasn't an Italian V12, it wasn't even recent. It's that thing. No, not this. That thing. That is Honda's first car. And even today, Honda is the king of the high-revving four-cylinder engine. Well, that's a legacy that started right there with a 9,500 RPM roadster, small enough that it can hide behind a Miata. If you're swapping an engine into a car where it doesn't belong, and you're not doing an LS swap, you're doing a K swap. And that, of course, means swapping in a Honda K-Series four-cylinder. And you chose that because Honda's four-cylinders are legendary for their durability, for their power, for the noise, and of course, all the revs. So it's hard for us to imagine a world before Honda existed. And yet, when you look at the road tests from this car, they were all concentrating on the intrigue of driving the first ever car from the Honda motorcycle company. It's easy for us to forget that the 1960s were a sort of second wave of car companies. We got Honda and we got Lamborghini, two car companies that went in very different directions. Honda is still independent and hasn't gone bankrupt 600 times. But I think more surprising is that Honda's first ever car is even more impressive than Lamborghini's was.
Honda had existed since the late 1940s as an unrivaled builder of motorcycles, but it was in 1962 that it grew a second set of wheels. Soichiro Honda had toyed with the idea of maybe building a car, casually, until 1961, when the Japanese government introduced a potential bill that would take all of the existing car makers and limit them to producing cars in one of three different categories: passenger cars, sports and specialty cars, or K cars.
If you weren't producing cars by the time the bill went into effect, you were never going to be allowed to. And this was never going to work for Honda. Soichiro Honda was a badass. He fought the government about everything, and this is one of those times.
He did two things. First, he mounted one of his many famous wars of words against the politicians pushing the bill, and secondly, went into high gear to start producing two types of cars, a K-car truck, the T360, and a sports car, as quickly as possible, just in case the bill passed. Barely a year after the potential bill was announced, Honda rolled out his prototype roadsters, the S360 and the S500. Named for their engine sizes, the S360 had a 356 under the hood, the S500 a big block 492.
American cars in the 1960s also had things like 350 and 500, but those were cubic inches. The S360 had a 356 cubic centimeter four-cylinder. That was 21 cubic inches, 21.7. And that might have been a little bit too small because Honda dropped the S360 for production in favor of the S500, which then grew to the S600 with 606 cc's, and then this, the big block, with a 791 under its power-bulged hood. So butch.
Disclaimer, there are some other detail changes from the original S500 to this later S800, but I'm going to talk about these sports series cars in general terms.
Second disclaimer, it was actually the S600 that was the highest revving. That's the one with a 9,500 RPM redline. This S800, the big block, only revved to 8,500 RPM, but the tachometer still went to 11, and that's because, according to the lore, the engine was good for 11 grand. It just didn't make any more power up there.
The four-cylinder was undoubtedly the highlight of the Honda sports car. It wasn't, as you might assume, a motorcycle engine stuffed into a car. At the time, Honda's motorcycle engines were two-stroke, air-cooled, single overhead cam, two-cylinders.
So this is Honda's first four-cylinder, and it's water-cooled, and for people who love engines, it is a complete technological masterpiece.
It used an aluminum crankcase with wet liners. It had chain-driven double overhead cams and hemispherical combustion chambers.
It had 4 carburetors, i.e. independent throttle bodies, all mounted on rubber to isolate the carburetors from the vibrations from those outrageously high RPMs to stop the fuel from frothing.
It also had equal-length exhaust headers and made 70 horsepower. which gave it the highest specific output of any production engine, 10% higher than the also new contemporary Lamborghini quad-cam V12.
It was missing one thing, an oil pressure sensor. And inside there's no oil pressure light. And that's not because Honda was being cheap. No. This engine doesn't need oil pressure because it uses a roller bearing crank.
On a conventional engine, the crankshaft spins inside bearings, which are just basically metal on metal. It's the oil pressure that keeps the metal surfaces from actually contacting each other.
Think of it like how the puck on an air hockey table never actually touches the table. It sort of levitates on a tiny cushion of air right above it. A roller bearing doesn't need oil pressure because it uses, get this, rollers to keep the moving parts separate. So it'd be more like roller skating across an air hockey table, which means far less friction, and in the case of an engine, far more revs. And if you were to actually roller skate across a hockey table, you'd probably also meet your annual out-of-pocket deductible for your health insurance, and that's a bonus.
The early cars also used chains to get the power from the differential to the rear wheels, and here's some motorcycle technology transfer at work. The chains were suspended inside the sealed suspension trailing arms, and it was fully independent suspension. It was also far quieter and more robust than you'd imagine, but for the later S800, Honda replaced it with a traditional solid axle, which stiffened the ride, but it didn't seem to hurt its handling one bit.
Contemporary road tests found the S800 was quicker both in a straight line and around a racetrack than most small cars that had twice the motor. Things like, for example, the MGB, which compared to an S800 was gargantuan. Then again, compared to an S800, everything is huge.
This is a truly tiny car. At 131 inches long, it's 23 inches shorter than that ND Miata, and a staggering 13 inches narrower.
There is an astonishing amount of room in this car, especially when you realize it's so little that I can easily reach both door handles, or I can just reach back and Flintstones my way across town. Very difficult, a lot worse than you think. The shifter is the size of a Q-tip. Look how cute. Everything's so tiny. And the interior is full of all these cool little features like the accessory wind spoiler and the height adjustable rear view mirror. To turn the heat on, you have to stop, pull over, open the hood, get out and open a tap. But it does have a setting called recircle. And that makes me re-giggle.
The coupe versions were even more practical, with storage for a small child in the space where the roof would fold into, according to period reviews, clearly written by people who had colicky babies at home. And packed into the chassis of the S800 is rack-and-pinion steering with only 2.5 turns lock to lock, and disc brakes at the front. It was, in some ways, fully modern, and in others, way ahead of its time.
The S800 is, as you might expect, an unmitigated riot to drive. Look, the driving position is kind of perfect. The steering is super light and very quick. The brake pedal is strangely heavy, but the brakes work really well, as does the suspension, even though the solid rear axle makes it pretty harsh back there. The clutch, perfectly progressive take-up, and the shifter, this would shame a brand new Miata in both the shortness of the throws and the precision of it. It's unbelievable. And you'd think an engine with an 8,500 RPM redline and no VTEC would have no torque down low, but that's not the case at all. This is an undersquare engine design, meaning the stroke is longer than the bore, and that helps it make torque everywhere in the rev range, even down low. Not that you're ever there for long. The gears are super short. At 60 miles an hour, in top gear, the engine is spinning 5,000 RPM. That means top gear in an S800 is not all that different from first gear in a Viper.
Honda pulled the plug on the S800 in 1970, and it didn't make another sports car until the S2000.
That was 30 years later, and the S2000 was also 30 inches longer. It had 4 times the motor of the S500, and it weighed twice as much. But it had one of those magnificent Honda 4-cylinders, and it revved to 8,900 RPM with an oil pressure light. Anyway, the original Car and Driver road test was written by Larry Webster, who's my boss here now at Hagerty, and he said, if the clothes make the man, then the engine definitely makes the car. I don't think I can think of truer words to describe either the S2000 or this.
But perhaps the most impressive thing is that this gorgeous, incredibly well-engineered and well-built roadster was the jumping off point for Honda's automobiles.
This is how you make an entrance as a new car company. It took that other new 60s car company, Lamborghini, a couple tries to get it right, and man, did they ever with the Miura. But the Miura could like barely make it to $8,000. Look, spend 10 minutes in a Honda S800 or 600 or 500, and you'll understand how Honda automobiles went from zero to the king of the four-cylinder in one shot.
Okay, so you're just gonna keep the Ferrari framed out the entire time, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Action.
I'm not some rich YouTuber asking you to like and subscribe. Hey, up, keep the Ferrari out. I'm an automotive journalist asking you to like and subscribe. And that's because that's how YouTube works. If you don't click those buttons, YouTube doesn't know you liked what you've just seen and isn't gonna show you any more of it. And if you don't like what you've just seen, well, join the club. And by that, I mean the Hagerty Drivers Club, which gets you access to this award-winning magazine, as well as discounts on amazing stuff. And if you still don't like what you've seen, well, then just leave a nasty comment, because that's how the internet works. I need to go clean that up.